Give him the forecast.
Omega level threat detected.
Xmen 97 is an absolute banger and a love letter to Marvel fans, specifically and X-Men fans, no matter your age. So much so that I watched both episode 1 and episode 2 at least 5 times. Yes, 5 times in a matter of like 2 days.
On the 5 time.
But enough about me, that's not what you're here for. Let's get to breaking Xmen 97 episode 1 to me, my X-Men, and let's get started right now because we need to break down all of the sweet, sweet Easter eggs that you may have missed along the way because again, all of the warm fuzzies and feels might have been all over the place and you might have missed some small details, but I got you. And my friends, this starts literally from the credits. The opening credits give you everything that we needed from the beginning because even in the background, as the Marvel marquee shows up, you can see animated characters starting with Spidey, Thing, then obviously Wolverine, what looks like it could be Silver Surfer, but it may be Morph 2, can't really tell from this angle, a zombified Cap from What If Zombies, and oh, Star-Lord T'Challa shows up as well.
Batman is playing Galaga. Thought we wouldn't notice, but we did.
Then everyone's favorite part of the entire episode, or every episode, I'm just going to go out and say this at this point, the official Marvel Batman theme song that everyone is now literally humming all over the place and probably playing on their desks when they're not doing anything useful with their time. But this is a slightly different rendition than what we would have known from the 90s version, but it's still very similar to it. And this rendition is given to us by the amazing Neely Broche, and the theme song now has an official title, which if you didn't know this, it is now going by the name of Never in Doubt, which is also very similar to Whitney Houston's I'm Your Baby Tonight, but that's a different topic for the podcast. Now, something I paid close attention to in the beginning of the credits for both episode 1 and 2, you will actually see a different person that leads the X-Men based on the person that shows up here. In episode 1, it's Cyclops. In episode 2, though, it's Magneto. Then something else to note here is that the animators went with a very similar sequence, or the very similar opening sequence that we remember from the 90s, which gives all of the warm fuzzies like sitting in front of your TV again as a kid. Then the opening scene gives us our title for this episode, To Me, My X-Men, which by the way is a play on a lot of things here, specifically because the first time that we actually see or hear this in comics, it comes from Charles Xavier at the end of X-Men 1. When he summons the entirety of the X-Men crew with his mind, but that is the first time that it is said in comics ever. But this also raises a few red flags or white flags, I don't know, because at this point it is still kind of up in the air in terms of who will be the leader of the X-Men now that Charles Xavier is gone. But by the end of this episode, it takes on a completely different meaning. Then we get a glimpse of what looks to be Times Square in 97, because coffee is $1. I mean, my goodness, it doesn't get any 90s than that. And we can also see the name of the DaCosta family sitting next to VistaCorp, which, if you don't know, in the Marvel Universe, VistaCorp is actually the owner of WHIH, the World News television channel. And this name is also seen in Ant-Man and referenced in Quantumania. But I have to say that the creators did a wonderful job setting the stage that everything is still inside of the 90s, because there are relics to the 90s everywhere. Because not only can we see a store that is now selling pagers, that same exact store is sitting next to a store that will allow you to go in and trade records, which it doesn't get any more 90s than that, because that's what everybody did. Oh, and there's a possible reference to Marshall Fields, maybe, to the store that is called The Fields that is next to the record store. There's also a Crazy Eddie's store as well. If you don't know about that store, that is a whole can of worms that basically needs its own video, but the owner actually was found out to be a really big fraud, and through the 70s and 80s, he actually was taken down. By the 90s, there was no Crazy Eddie store at all because all of them, or at least majority of them, had been gone bankrupt or belly up. But next to the Crazy Eddie store, you can see two mutants that show up later on in episode 2 as a police squad car goes around its round. And then we hear the news anchor hit the airwaves for the first time, which describes that Charles Xavier has been assassinated by Henry Gyrick. And if you grew up like I did, you probably had a bunch of the same feels that I did when you watched this, because at 6 o'clock on the dot, if you were in your grandmother's house, it was always going to be news playing. Oh, and by the way, Henry Gyrick shows up in Avengers 165 in his first appearance in comic. Now, as Robert DaCosta arrives at the skate park, which is another 90s staple, gotta look at you, Tony Hawk Pro Skater, we see him in a mutant collar, which keeps his powers at bay, which you probably want to do that. And we also see the Mega Man crew, or otherwise known as the Friends of Humanity, which now have their flag plastered all over the place. But this shows that FOH somehow got their hands on Sentinel Tech and now has created Mega Man Blast. We then hear one of the goons say that the buyer will give them 10K each if they turn over a mutant, which the buyer possibly could be Trask. Another one of the goons actually responds and says maybe he's using it for target practice, which again, if that is Trask, that would possibly mean that he was already and had already known where mutants were, and he was just biding time to go and get them. Roberto then says that he is one of the good ones, but that then is kind of ironic when he asks Cyclops, are you a good guy or a bad guy? Then enter Storm. And can I just say, they did Storm right. Storm, for the first episode, from the punchy monologues to just her presence on screen, bring it in. Come. And when old dude says that he's not afraid of her and she turns to him and says,
then you are a fool.
I lost it. But seeing Storm and Bishop inside of the same scene and the beginning of the episode set the tone for this beautifully, because if you haven't figured out by now, Storm is one of my favorite X-Men and Bishop is a really close second. And now, if I'm not mistaken, the guy that continues to run his mouth is the Executioner that we see in episode 2. But this episode is not about him, so more about him in the next videos in the future. Then enter Scott, and they finally did that man justice. Yes, sir. Because this dude came in like a wrecking ball.
I came in like a wrecking ball.
I mean, fully upgraded, ready to roll heads. Now, as we fast forward a bit through this epic battle, I cannot forget this moment from Scott when he decides to play coy and give himself up and then blows the entire room to smithereens. And once again, I am here for it. But as it blows up, you see a Benton's ad, which would have been everywhere in the 90s. And to give this a little bit more flair, the ad is actually for a fashion show for Mutant, which is something that would have been done inside of the 90s as well to draw in a specific crowd, a younger crowd more than likely. Then as we transition to the school, we do so through the lens of an X, which is very similar to the doors that we've seen in the Foxverse over the years. So could this be a slight nod to the Foxverse? Just saying, maybe I might be reading into that just a little bit too much. We then hear Scott scolding Gambit, who is making beignets at the moment because he should have been on the battlefield with them. The voice acting here kind of left me wanting a little bit more from this particular character, because Gambit, played by AJ Locascio, did a decent job. I won't take anything from him. However, it did leave me wanting a little bit more of the Creole that it would have had in the beginning stages of the animated series, because you really only hear it when he says something specifically from that area, and everything else just kind of gets lost in translation. But they did do a good job with his character model, giving him the bad boy punk rock version of Gambit in this particular season. We then hear Rogue, played by Lenore Zahn, Morph, played by Ron Rubin, and Jean now enter the kitchen, and we now find out that Jean is pregnant. And they're also jamming to some NSYNC type jams in the background, and again adds more 90s feels to everything that's going on. After the team discusses their recent run-in with FOH, we head into Beast's lab, who is again played by George Busa. Then we get a glimpse of Beast's book collection, which includes J. Leewald and George Orwell's Animal Farm, which is a political fable based on the events of Russia's Bolshevik Revolution and the betrayal of the cause by Joseph Stalin, which is a fitting read by Beast given the fact that he probably was maybe reading this to figure out how to bridge these two types of dynamics, humans and mutants, which again is something that Trask actually fears. Then the training sequence that follows is actually a part of the X-Men formula, because if you hadn't known this before, the X-Men comics are constructed in a 4-part act, which usually goes Act 1, training, Act 2, character introspection, Act 3, uncovering of the bad guy, and then Act 4, the battle begins, bringing all of them together to fight said bad guy from before. And if you pay close attention to each episode, you'll see that formula play out by the writers. But in said training sequence, we hear the voice of Magneto, which is given in his classic garb, which we don't see later on. And again, we get the welcome voice of Cathal Dodd's Wolverine when he says,
Scary enough for you, bub?
man, that bub will get you every time. Now, in the photo that follows the training scene, we see the first group of X-Men that is taken from the first circulation of the X-Men comic. Angel, Jean, who became a part of the group later but shows up in X-Men 1 as well, Iceman, Scott, aka Cyclops, and Professor X. Jean and Scott are then seen talking to the UN leader, and one of the funniest parts of this particular scene is when Scott pokes fun at the fact that she's doing cardio right now in the midst of a very important meeting about what is going on between human and mutant relations.
Well, when cardio wraps, maybe you can spare the calories to go make sure he didn't build another one.
And this is specifically after Scott has now received the death certificate of one Charles Xavier, who, by the way, has died at least 12 or so times in the comics, maybe even more. But this entire exchange between Scott and the UN leader is also very 90s in terms of what she's doing and wearing, because in 90s movies, people in power were always doing something not important when they were supposed to be inside of an important meeting, like working out. But speaking of the professor yet again, do you think that he's really dead? Leave that down in the comments. But in the conversation had between Jean and Scott here, this is the start of the second act, because here is where we start to see more layers of the characters start to come out because of the conversations that they're starting to have, specifically the one that is had between Scott and Jean when they take into consideration their son being born and if they would need to leave. And then this spills over into the basketball court scene through the nightclub scene. Speaking of that nightclub scene, let's fast forward to that a bit, shall we? And as we do, we see a comic arcade being lit up in neon lights on the side, which is very 90s again, because I spent a lot of time inside of these things. But of course, we're placed right inside of a rave because again, this is the 90s. What else are we gonna do? And the music playing at this point is literally, again, very 90s-esque, because that is literally what was played all over pop stations everywhere when I was a kid. But during this scene, Wolverine seems to be the only person in the group that has now put two and two together and sees the writing on the wall, because he tells Morph that Jean and Scott will be leaving, but no one else has put this together though. And we see that fact when Jubilee actually comes out in the end later on, when they do realize and say that they're going to leave, that she had no idea.
Cyclops and Jean were the first X-Men. if they're gone, who the heck is gonna lead the team?
But back to the nightclub scene. Maybe this is just me reading into this way too much, but didn't that dance scene feel a little cringy and a little NPC-esque, like you weren't supposed to be there? No, just me? Okay. I see myself out. But you almost do forget how strong Rogue actually is until she does stuff like this, when she takes one of the blasters and crushes it with her bare hands. Then as we head into the prison, more Storm monologue goodness shows back up again, and it's so refreshing every time that it happens. Her monologue is then met with a rebuttal from Henry Gyrick about mutants being the thing that is wrong with the world, and that making more room for them pushes everyone that is not a mutant out, which digs deep into the X-Men theme over the years, which, by the way, it didn't start that way, but it kind of went and morphed into what it is now over a course of many tellings of these stories. But this monologue by Gyrick also ends or bookends the second act, and the third act is specifically started when Scott says,
No, but have you met my wife?
Because it's here that we find out that Trask did in fact create a second master mode in the Sahara Desert. But from Jean's vision, it gets even worse this time, to the point that she sees graves of what could be mutants of many kinds. But this also made me think, did she somehow come into contact with herself in a different reality? The team loads up and heads directly to Trask, but before they do, a Sentinel drops in and literally takes the roof off of everything. But the way that that Sentinel looks down inside of their aircraft, bruh, that would have sent chills up my spine, almost to the fact where I would have, or at least it put me back into the mindset of a 90s show called Legends of the Hidden Temple, which, if you know about that show and if you ever wanted to go on that show, you're crazy, because they had people that would actually stand inside of trees and then hug you. I don't want to do that. Like, literally, bruh, each time that I watched it, I felt like he was looking at me through Scott. It was But this then gives us one of the best aerial scenes inside of the MCU we have ever seen to date, and that is even talking about stuff with Iron Man. And y'all know I love Iron Man, because this not only shows the combined strength of the X-Men, but individually how they shine as well, which then when they come back together, it shows and shines even brighter. Then with Scott's, to me, my X-Men, we open the fourth act, which then opens up the battle scene, which shows that Trask did in fact use recycled parts of his Sentinel fleet that he had before to make the ones that he now has in front of us right now. And for me, this battle gave me two of the most favorite scenes of this particular episode for me, when Wolverine gets his claws charged by Gambit and then literally hurls through a Sentinel, and when Scott says,
Give him the forecast.
Bruh, every time that I watch it, there is something different that I see each and every time about Storm's entrance. There's literally thousands of things going on as she's walking on the sand. And if you don't know, what she's doing or creating around her is glass. The reason she can do that is because of lightning, and if you didn't know, that's what it becomes, or when you heat up sand into really high temperatures, that's what it becomes, and that's literally what's in your computer right now. So the very fact that she can take this much heat and do what she wills with it, bruh, there is nothing that you can do with anything that she touches. And they know that because they say she's the only Omega level threat that is on the field. Then more stuff blows up because of Storm, and I'm sweating because I'm talking about Storm so vividly because, again, can you tell that she's one of my favorite X-Men? And then Trask is placed under arrest, like he should be, which then leads us to the infamous basketball scene where Scott and Jean tell the crew that they are in fact going to step away from the X-Men, but that is short-lived by none other than Magneto when he drops in and says that he now owns everything that Charles had because of his last will and testament. And now we again hear the words, "my X-Men," at the end of this episode, which takes on a completely different meaning now. Man, this season is going to be an incredible ride, and I for one am colored excited. I mean, you can't tell by this point. If you feel like taking another trip down memory lane, go ahead and hit this playlist right above me. And until next time, until next video, y'all be smooth, blurred out.